Leo DuFour was supposed to be gone for just 2 days. An experienced and careful hiker, he set off alone in late November 2024 to conquer Allen Mountain, one of the most remote and unforgiving peaks in New York's Adirondacks. He signed the trail register, took his gear, and vanished into the wilderness. Then, nothing. For nearly 5 months, the forest offered no clues, no footprints, no calls for help, no trace. As winter deepened, search crews braved brutal terrain and blinding snow, but the mountain kept its secret. It wasn't until the spring thaw in May 2025 that hikers stumbled across something haunting just off the path, something that would finally break the silence. This is the chilling true story of Leo DuFour, a young man swallowed by the wild and the mystery that unfolded in the shadows of the high peaks. Thank you for choosing my video among thousands of videos out there to watch. Helping me with a subscription of yours is very small but very big and too valuable. Leo DuFour was not the kind of person to seek attention. Quiet, thoughtful, and deeply connected to nature. The 22-year-old from Vaudreuil, a small town in Quebec, Canada, was known among friends and family for his love of the outdoors. Hiking for Leo wasn't just a weekend hobby, it was a part of who he was. He had already conquered some of the most challenging trails across Canada and the northeastern US. Each journey a personal test, a quiet adventure into solitude and wild beauty. By late November 2024, Leo had his eyes set on his next summit, Allen Mountain, in the remote High Peaks region of the Adirondacks in upstate New York. It was no ordinary hike. Allen is one of the most rugged and least accessible mountains in the region, long, steep, and notoriously difficult, especially in winter. Many seasoned hikers avoid it during the colder months, but Leo wasn't just any hiker. He was experienced, methodical, and well-prepared. The trip was meant to be solo, just another challenge before the year's end. On November 28th, he crossed into New York State and arrived in the quiet town of Newcomb, nestled deep in the forested wilderness. The next morning, November 29th, Leo drove to the Mount Adams trailhead where he signed the trail register. His entry indicated he intended to complete the hike in a single day, a long and difficult trek, but one well within his capabilities. That entry, handwritten and time-stamped, would be the last known action he ever took. From that moment on, Leo DuFour simply vanished. The trail to Allen Mountain is not marked by crowds or casual hikers. It winds through dense forest, crosses icy streams, climbs steep ridges, and cuts through tangled brush with no mercy for the unprepared. It is wild and remote, even more so as winter sets in. Snow was already on the ground that morning, and the forecast called for worsening conditions in the coming days. Still, Leo pressed on, likely seeing this as yet another opportunity to test himself. But sometime after he left the trailhead, something went wrong, something that no one could have predicted and no one saw coming. Leo hadn't told many people about the hike. He was independent, self-reliant, and probably saw no reason to make a fuss over what he considered routine. That decision would complicate everything. As night fell on November 29th, and Leo failed to return, or check in, no alarm was raised. The wilderness swallowed his trail, and the clock began ticking silently on a mystery that would grip two countries for months to come. In the stillness of the Adirondacks, with winter closing in, Leo DuFour disappeared without a sound. When Leo didn't come home that night, his father grew uneasy. It wasn't like his son to go completely silent. Leo might have pushed limits on the trail, but he always respected time. By the next day, November 30, that unease hardened into fear. There was no message, no call, no digital ping, just silence. Leo's father, realizing something was wrong, contacted authorities and reported his son missing. The search began immediately. On December 1st, the New York State Police and Department of Environmental Conservation mobilized forest rangers and rescue teams to the Mount Adams trailhead, the last place Leo was known to be. There, they made a chilling discovery. Leo's vehicle was still parked where he had left it 2 days earlier, now blanketed under a soft layer of snow. It hadn't moved. That simple, silent detail turned suspicion into dread. The forest hadn't returned him. Search crews launched into action, combing the long and brutal trail to Allen Mountain. But nature was already closing in. Snow had fallen heavily across the region in the days following Leo's disappearance. In some areas, especially above 3,000 feet, in elevation snowdrifts had reached over 4 feet. Winds howled across ridgelines and visibility shrank to mere yards in places. Rangers had to battle thick underbrush, icy slopes, and fast-moving streams that now churned with freezing runoff. Helicopters were grounded by weather. Snowshoes barely made a dent in the crusted drifts. Every footstep was a fight. Still, the teams pushed forward, refusing to give in. Dozens of forest rangers, some of the most experienced in the state, rotated in shifts. Day after day, they mapped and walked the trails, calling Leo's name, scanning for signs, a broken branch, a scrap of clothing, disturbed snow, anything that might suggest where he had gone. But the forest gave them nothing. There were no footprints, no gear, no clues, just silence. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fray. The search never truly ended, but its tone shifted. Conversations moved from "when we find him" to "if we find him." The odds were cruel and clear. In the Adirondacks, winter is not a season, it is a force. The longer someone is alone in those mountains, without contact, the slimmer their chances become. And yet, even as headlines faded and public attention moved on, Leo's family refused to give up. They believed that their son somewhere in those vast woods was waiting to be found. They clung to every lead, every word from search teams, every report from hikers who passed through the area in the weeks that followed. But Allen Mountain held its secret close. The same forest that Leo had loved now stood silent and impenetrable, offering no answers, only snowstone and cold. From the moment Leo DuFour was reported missing, the response was urgent and relentless. More than 50 New York State Forest Rangers were deployed, some of the most highly trained search and rescue personnel in the region. Over the following days, they would log more than 400 miles on foot across the brutal terrain of the Adirondacks. This was not a search for the faint of heart. The Adirondack high peaks in winter are an unforgiving labyrinth of deep ravines, snow-laden forests, and treacherous ridgelines. And Allen Mountain, Leo's last known destination, is one of the most remote and least traveled of them all. Its isolation is legendary among hikers, not just for its difficulty, but for its lack of clear trails and heavy, often unbroken underbrush. The route to the summit demands crossing frigid streams, navigating steep ascents, and pushing through miles of forest that seem to fight back with every step. By the time search teams reached the area in early December, winter had already tightened its grip on the region. Snowfall had been intense, especially above 3,000 feet. In some areas, drifts reached waist-deep, and beneath the snow lay layers of ice and hidden hazards. Rangers used snowshoes, but even those struggled to make headway through the dense terrain. Each step was exhausting. Every slope was slippery and unstable. Visibility was often poor, with snow flurries rolling in, suddenly clouding views and muffling sound. In many cases, the crews had to stop and reevaluate their routes simply because the landmarks they depended on were buried or unrecognizable. Hoping that modern technology could give them an edge, the teams brought in helicopters to scan the wilderness from above. Infrared sensors were deployed, devices capable of detecting even faint body heat signatures beneath the tree canopy. But these hopes were quickly tempered. The same weather that made ground searches so brutal also grounded aircraft. Low visibility, gusting winds, and thick snow squalls meant helicopters could only fly in brief windows, often returning without new information. And the forest canopy, dense with evergreens and heavy with snow, shielded much of the ground below from thermal imaging. Even advanced tools couldn't pierce the wall of nature that separated the searchers from the truth. Still, the operation pushed forward. Rangers divided the terrain into grids, checking each one systematically. It wasn't just a physical challenge, it was emotional. Every day, they entered the forest knowing that a young man was out there somewhere, and the clock was running out. They searched creeks, rock ledges, and hollows, looking for a dropped glove, a broken branch, any disturbance that might mark Leo's passage. But the forest, indifferent and massive, offered no trail. Not a single trace of Leo was found, not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a clue. And as the days passed, the snow kept falling, sealing over the ground like a white veil, hiding whatever secrets the mountain might hold. What began as a desperate rescue effort was becoming a battle against time, weather, and the silence of nature itself. 8 days after Leo DuFour was reported missing, the mission changed. Quietly, without ceremony, the terminology shifted from rescue to recovery. That one word, so subtle yet final, carried enormous weight. It was an acknowledgement that after over a week in winter wilderness with no signs of life, the likelihood of finding Leo alive had dropped to near zero. This wasn't just about survival. It was now about bringing him home, whatever that might mean. But even with this heartbreaking pivot, the search did not stop. The forest rangers pressed on, showing a level of dedication that went beyond protocol. They had formed a connection not to a name on paper, but to a young man whose story they now carried with them on every mile of trail. Leo wasn't just a missing person. He had become a presence in that forest. And though nature had gone quiet, the teams refused to abandon the effort. Behind the scenes, Leo's family clung to hope. His parents and relatives continued to check in with authorities, following every update, no matter how small. For them, the reclassification of the mission was not an end. It was a shift in strategy. They knew Leo had entered that mountain by choice, experienced, smart and well prepared. Maybe somehow he had found shelter. Maybe he was injured, but alive, waiting out the storm. That thread of belief, though stretched thin by time, never fully snapped. They waited every day for a call that would bring news. Meanwhile, the forest seemed determined to keep its silence. The deeper winter set in, the more impenetrable the landscape became. Temperatures plummeted. Trails froze over. Snowstorms erased the footprints of rescuers almost as fast as they were made. Days turned into weeks, then months. The rangers who had walked hundreds of miles in brutal cold were eventually forced to scale back. Official operations were reduced, but not forgotten. The DEC made clear that any new information would reactivate the search instantly. Tips continued to trickle in, reports of possible sightings, but none credible. The truth remained buried under snow, somewhere between the trailhead and the summit. And so began a long, painful silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fade, but deepens over time. For the public, the story of Leo DuFour began to slip from headlines. For those who had hiked the trail in search of him, who had stared into the white wilderness and hoped for something, anything, the absence of answers was devastating. Allen Mountain had swallowed a young man, and the only thing it gave in return was more snow, more wind, more stillness. Yet despite everything, Leo's name continued to echo in the hearts of those who searched, those who waited, and those who refused to let him be forgotten. The Adirondacks hold their secrets well, especially in winter. Snow covers everything: trails, signs, footprints, even memories. But seasons change, and with spring comes a kind of reckoning. On May 10, 2025, nearly 6 months after Leo DuFour vanished, that reckoning came. It was a Saturday morning, clear and brisk, when a group of experienced hikers set out along the rugged trail leading toward Allen Mountain. The snow had melted, and the forest, long frozen and silent, was beginning to breathe again. Streams gushed with fresh runoff. Trees swayed gently in the wind. Birds had returned. But amid that slow reawakening, something unexpected waited just beyond the path. The hikers were several miles into their climb, deep in the remote wilderness between Mount Adams and Allen, when one of them noticed something strange about 20 feet off the trail, a shape not quite natural, half concealed beneath leaves, twigs, and forest debris. At first, they thought it was a bundle of gear, maybe an old backpack or a lost tent. But as they drew closer, the truth began to take shape. It wasn't gear. It was the outline of a human body. They stopped cold. The forest, once alive with the rustling of branches and bird calls, seemed to fall still in that moment. The group did not touch anything. They backed away slowly, their instincts kicking in, and immediately contacted authorities. Within hours, New York State Police and forest rangers arrived at the site. They approached with caution. Nothing could be disturbed, not yet. The area was cordoned off, and procedures were followed with solemn care. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, partially clothed, weathered by months of exposure to the elements. It was clear that whoever this was had been there for some time, months at least. There were no obvious signs of violence, no weapons, no dragging marks, just the body tangled with branches and half buried in the slow sediment of the forest floor. It was less than a quarter-mile from the main trail, a haunting proximity that unsettled everyone involved. It meant that through all those cold, silent months of winter, the missing person had been lying nearby, just out of sight, just beyond the reach of even the most determined searchers. The discovery sent a shockwave through the small community of Vadrillian and through everyone who had followed Leo's case. Though the remains were not yet identified, many suspected who it might be. And those who had searched the woods before now faced the crushing thought that they may have unknowingly passed within feet of him. The remains were carefully collected and transported under the supervision of the Essex County coroner. The discovery marked the beginning of the end of a mystery, but not necessarily the answers that people had longed for. The forest had finally given something back. What it hadn't offered yet was an explanation. The remains recovered near Allen Mountain were by all outward signs those of a hiker. Clothing boots, a weathered watch. These personal effects told a quiet story even before the body was formally identified. The brands matched what Leo DuFour was believed to have worn on his final hike. But still, officials proceeded with caution. The body was too decomposed for visual identification, and no ID had been found at the scene. A forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Secura, was assigned to examine the remains. It was his task to provide answers where none yet existed, to confirm who this person was, and perhaps how they had died. In the days that followed, tension hovered like a fog over those who had followed the case. Leo's family once again found themselves waiting in silence. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the emptiness of not knowing where he was. It was the heaviness of almost knowing, of being on the edge of closure while fearing what it might confirm. Days passed, then the call came. It was Leo. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains were those of 22-year-old Leo DuFour, the Canadian hiker who had gone missing on November 29, 2024. After months of searching, of hoping, of grieving without direction, the mystery had a name again. Leo had been found. His disappearance, which had launched one of the most extensive winter search operations in Adirondack history, had ended not far from where it began. The confirmation was both a relief and a heartbreak. He was no longer missing, but he was still gone. As for the cause of death, that was where the answer stopped. Dr. Secura's examination could not determine a specific reason. There were no broken bones, No trauma indicative of an attack or fall. No evidence of foul play. No clear signs of freezing or drowning. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. For the authorities, that meant no further criminal investigation was required. For the family, it meant something far worse, an answer that didn't explain anything. They were left with more questions than closure. Had Leo fallen and simply not been found? Had he become disoriented, wandered off the trail, and succumbed to the cold? Was it something medical, a sudden collapse, a condition no one knew about? The evidence gave nothing away. Months of exposure had erased most clues. Time, weather, and the forest itself had stripped the story down to only its ending. And even that remained incomplete. But still something had changed. The silence was broken. The not knowing was over. Leo had come home, not in the way anyone had hoped, but in the only way the mountain would allow. His story, once scattered across miles of wilderness, had now returned to his family, even if it arrived without a final chapter. The forest had finally given Leo DuFour back, but it hadn't given back his story. With the confirmation of his identity came a strange quiet, not the empty silence of uncertainty, but the heavy silence of questions that refused to be answered. The remains told little. There were no signs of foul play, no obvious injuries, no indication of a struggle. The official autopsy returned with the most unsatisfying verdict possible: cause of death undetermined. After months of searching, hoping, and speculating, that one word left everything suspended in ambiguity. For Leo's family, it was a crushing kind of closure. They had found their son, but not the truth. The location where Leo's body was found only deepened the mystery. He had come to hike Allen Mountain, a remote and brutal trail. Yet, his body was discovered just off the main path, close enough that other hikers had unknowingly passed within yards of him over the winter. Search teams who had scoured the region on foot for days in December had been unable to find him. Was he overlooked in the storm? Had he fallen just out of sight in a moment of crisis? Or had he wandered from the trail in confusion, only to collapse within reach of help that never came? The absence of trauma ruled out immediate physical injury. There were no broken limbs, no lacerations, no wounds suggestive of an animal attack or violent encounter. Toxicology was inconclusive. His gear, while weather-worn, appeared intact. Nothing suggested foul play. Yet something had gone wrong. Leo was an experienced hiker, trained, prepared, and physically fit. He had tackled harder trails before. He wasn't careless. And yet, somewhere between signing the trail register and reaching the summit or never reaching it, something happened that ended his life. In the vacuum left by hard facts, theories began to take root. Maybe he slipped on the icy terrain and was injured too badly to move. Maybe the cold overtook him after a wrong turn and he succumbed to hypothermia. Perhaps a sudden medical event left him incapacitated, and he never had a chance to seek help. Or maybe in a moment of panic, triggered by fear, disorientation, or the presence of a wild animal, he made a fatal decision and strayed off the path. Each theory carried some weight. Each one matched some aspect of what was known. but none could be confirmed. The mountain had concealed not just Leo's body, but the truth about what happened to him. And even now, with that body recovered, it continued to hold back answers. For those who had followed the search, who had hiked those same trails, or sat at home watching the updates, the most unsettling part wasn't just how Leo died, it was how completely he vanished and how close he had been all along. With no definitive cause of death, Leo DuFour's story became the subject of educated speculation. 4 primary theories emerged, each one rooted in the harsh realities of wilderness survival and the unique dangers of the Adirondack high peaks in winter. These weren't wild guesses, but grounded possibilities based on known risks, terrain data, and psychological patterns in remote hiking scenarios. Theory 1: accidental fall. The most widely accepted explanation is that Leo suffered an accidental fall. The trails near Allen Mountain are notoriously treacherous, especially in winter. Hidden ledges, slick rocks, and narrow paths can turn deadly under a layer of snow and ice. Even experienced hikers can be caught off guard. One misstep in the wrong place, a misplaced boot, a patch of hidden frost, and a person can fall into a ravine or down a slope with no way to climb back. If Leo fell and was injured severely, it's likely he couldn't move or call for help. He would have been alone, exposed to the elements, immobilized, and slowly overtaken by the cold. Theory 2: hypothermia and exposure. The Adirondack winter is brutal. Even a well-prepared hiker like Leo could be overtaken by the weather. Hypothermia doesn't require days, it can set in within hours. All it takes is wet clothing, wind exposure, and dropping core body temperature. In early stages, a person may feel numb and confused. As it worsens, they become irrational, sometimes even removing clothing in a state called paradoxical undressing. If Leo got wet, exhausted, or lost, he might have misjudged how far he was from safety. He may have wandered off the trail and sat down expecting to warm up or recover, only to fall unconscious and never wake up. Theory 3: medical emergency. Leo was young, fit, and experienced, but even youth doesn't rule out sudden health issues. A cardiac event, stroke, or seizure could have struck without warning. A hidden heart condition, asthma, or even dehydration, combined with altitude and stress, might have triggered a collapse. If Leo had no time to react or was unable to call for help, he could have simply fallen where he stood. The lack of trauma on his body supports this possibility, a quiet internal cause rather than an external threat. Theory 4: animal encounter and panic. While there was no physical evidence of an animal attack, that doesn't eliminate the possibility of a panic-driven response. The Adirondacks are home to bears, coyotes, and other wildlife. If Leo encountered an animal or even heard something threatening, fear could have driven him to flee the trail in haste. In moments of panic, people don't always act rationally. He may have run blindly into deeper woods, disoriented and driven by adrenaline. Once off-trail, finding his way back, especially in snowy conditions, would have been nearly impossible. Disoriented, alone, and exposed, he may have fallen victim to the elements soon after. All of these theories are possible. None can be proven. That's what makes Leo's story so haunting. It wasn't a lack of preparation or reckless behavior that claimed him. He did what hikers are taught to do. He signed the register, packed his gear, planned his route. But sometimes, nature doesn't give you time to adjust. Sometimes, even when everything is done right, it's still not enough. Leo's story is a reminder that the wilderness doesn't owe us safety. And sometimes, the trail doesn't tell us how it ends. The discovery of Leo DuFour's body may have closed one chapter of his story, but it opened another one, defined by quiet reflection, public mourning, and lingering questions. News of his identification spread quickly, crossing borders and headlines. In Canada, his hometown of Vaudreuil mourned the young man who had once walked its wooded paths and dreamed of higher peaks. In the United States particularly, within the hiking and outdoor community, the impact was equally profound. Leo's disappearance had never been just another lost hiker story. It had become a test of endurance for rescuers, for loved ones, and for the wilderness itself. The scale of the effort to find him was staggering. Over 50 forest rangers, specialized rescue teams, helicopters, drones tracking dogs, and infrared scanners had all been deployed in one of the most difficult terrains in the Northeast. Hundreds of man-hours were poured into a landscape that seemed determined to hide him. Despite every resource, every ounce of training, and every piece of modern technology brought to bear, Leo remained missing until spring unlocked the mountains again. It was a sobering realization. Sometimes even the best efforts made by the most prepared professionals are no match for the raw, untamed force of nature. Leo's story struck a deep chord with hikers, both amateur and experienced. Many saw a version of themselves in him, young, adventurous, careful, passionate about the outdoors. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't naive. He was one of the prepared ones, the responsible ones. That's what made his disappearance so unsettling. It wasn't a story of someone who ignored warnings or took foolish risks. It was a story of how the wilderness, with all its beauty, can turn quiet and lethal without warning. His case became a topic of conversation in hiking forums, outdoor safety workshops, and community circles across the US and Canada. People debated what could have been done differently, whether he should have taken a satellite beacon, whether solo hikes should be discouraged during shoulder seasons, whether trail systems in remote regions should be better marked. But the answers were elusive, much like the truth of what happened that day in November. The one consensus was this: Leo DuFour's story had changed something. It had reminded people that the line between adventure and tragedy is often thinner than we want to believe. In the end, the impact of Leo's disappearance wasn't measured only by the search operation or media coverage. It was measured in the quiet conversations between hikers, now choosing to wait for better weather, in parents gently asking their adult children to leave more detailed itineraries, in the subtle but permanent shift in how people viewed safety in the backcountry. Leo's name became more than just a headline. It became a lesson and a memory etched into the landscape of the Adirondacks and the hearts of all who followed his journey. Leo DuFour didn't fit the stereotype of someone who vanishes in the wilderness. He wasn't untrained, unfit, or unprepared. He didn't ignore the trail register. He wasn't chasing danger for the thrill of it. He was a skilled, thoughtful hiker who knew the risks and loved the solitude of wild places. That's what makes his story so haunting, because it proves that even the most experienced aren't immune to nature's unpredictability. His death wasn't the result of recklessness. It was the result of a world that doesn't always offer second chances, no matter how carefully you plan. In the aftermath of his discovery, Leo's story began to take on a second life, not as a news headline, but as a cautionary tale. His name now comes up in conversations among hikers preparing for winter treks. Outdoor educators reference his disappearance in safety briefings. Rescue personnel use his case as a reminder that every search can be the one that ends in silence. The mountains don't discriminate. They don't adjust for your experience, level, your preparation, or your intentions. They simply are. And when conditions shift, when snow falls, when visibility drops, or fatigue sets in, the consequences can be swift and irreversible. Leo's journey is now taught through its absence of conclusion. We may never know what caused him to veer off trail, whether it was an injury, disorientation, cold, or simply bad luck. But what we do know is that he went out with respect for nature and full confidence in his ability. And still, he did not return. That gap between ability and outcome is where the lesson lies. It's in the understanding that preparation must include more than gear and route planning. It must include humility, knowing that the wilderness is bigger, stronger, and more indifferent than we sometimes admit. For future hikers, Leo's story stands as a somber warning. Tell someone where you're going. Bring a satellite tracker or emergency beacon, especially if you're hiking alone. Don't underestimate early winter conditions or assume experience is a shield against misfortune. Most of all, listen to the forest, to the weather, and to your own limits. Adventure and risk are close cousins. Know when to turn back. Leo DuFour didn't make a reckless decision that day. He simply went for a hike like many he had done before. And he didn't come back. That is what makes his story unforgettable. In the quiet space between courage and caution, between love for the wild and respect for its power, Leo's voice now lingers, a silent reminder that even those who do everything right can still be lost to the mountains. And that's why we remember him not just to mourn his passing, but to carry his story forward as a guide for others who dare to follow the trail. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Your support truly means the world to me. If this video brought you value or resonated with you in any way, feel free to leave a little comment or hit subscribe so we can keep sharing more moments together. See you in the next one.